Hi, everyone. I'm here tonight with Hans, and Hans started emailing me, I would say last fall, with some information about where he lives in New England, primarily New Hampshire and Maine. And I started to go through the information that he sent me and invited him to do a presentation with me so he could talk about the areas of interest that he was highlighting in the information that he sent. And so I put together a PowerPoint. There's always way more than what ends up in a PowerPoint. And thankfully, this is what Hans is most familiar with
Yeah.
from your feedback. But there was a list of places in New Hampshire, for example, that it would take hours and days to go through all the information. So I'm just really glad that you're interested in this subject because it takes all of us. It's all hands on deck. There's so much information to uncover. And I'm pretty interested in this point at coastal New England because I think there's a bigger story there. And you're going to talk a little bit about that here. So before I go to the PowerPoint, Hans, is there anything you'd like to say about yourself and how we got here?
Yeah, I feel like I'm a pretty average, normal person. I've done construction most of my life. And so, I think one of the first videos that I saw that you did had something to do with the mud flood theory. And so, mud flood theory came like way late in my kind of awakening, you might call it. I was always interested in megalithic structures like the pyramids, obviously, and other areas around the world. But then when I started hearing people talk about this mud flood theory, it kind of got to me because I can understand how we got the history wrong on the pyramids and things like that. But how did we get the history wrong in the early 1800s and early 1900s? You know, like my great grandparents' generation leading up till now. That's really what caught my attention, and I started, my own cognitive dissonance, you might call it. It was a hard one for me to wrap my mind around, and I think it's a good subject for people to look into and try to think about, because when you look at some of these old buildings, especially the brick ones, I know how long it takes to build buildings like this, and I know you don't, like, people talk about basement windows and things like that, and like, oh, we still do basement windows, but no, there's a whole floor underneath, and that window is already framed up and everything. So that's what really kind of caught my attention.
Yeah, it's interesting how they've managed to hide all of this around us. And so I first learned about the mud flood, I guess in 2019, after I started doing my research following ley lines. And then when I looked at the YouTube creator that I was connected to by a mutual subscriber, which was Baltimore Fats, I realized we were looking at the same buildings. And
Yeah.
so I added mud flood to the bigger theory, and then it seems like that happens. A new subject will come up and it gets added because it makes sense, like giant trees. Which Chad of the Deeper Conversations with Chad YouTube channel brought into my awareness, things like that. And so I started with megaliths like yourself. That was my big draw into this whole alternative subject matter. And the one thing that's verboten is megaliths in North America. There aren't supposed to be any. And so we'll do a pretty good job of really ripping that whole subject apart because the places that Hans sent me to look at is full of megaliths.
Right. Well, so that's like, I can understand, like, growing up right here in New Hampshire, and we America supposedly got started to be settled in the New England area, and then it was the Wild West out west. But when you look at it and the World's Fairs and everything, it's like these cities were already built out in California and everywhere across the United States. And, I could see how people could be like, well, we settled in New England at a certain period of time. And maybe they had enough time and enough manpower that they built some of these buildings. But it really doesn't add up when you look at it nationwide.
Yeah, and the other subject that you mentioned, which is our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents' generation, is a whole nother rabbit hole because
Mm-hmm.
basically we've all been lied to. So, for example, our parents' generation learn from their parents. And, at some point, the history just doesn't add up. And I think we'll be looking at some of that in this presentation also. So sometime in the early to mid 1800s, the population started to come in and increase, and a lot of things going on around that time period, the mid 19th century. A lot of stuff going on. So, and a lot of family histories start then. But then you have people with documented lineages. What's that all about? There's a lot of unanswered questions in the realm of our own family histories and what's going on with that. So I'm going to go ahead and share this screen. I put together a PowerPoint with the images that I pulled out there, and you checked it over and said it was good to go. And it's really kind of cool because I find that sometimes when I just type in a blank slide, a really cool image will come up. So I just kind of go with that. So that may or may not be Maine, but it kind of looks like it a little bit. So we'll go with it. A presentation on Old World New Hampshire and Maine with Hanz. With the first set of information I pulled, which is on Matinicus Island in Penobscot Bay in Maine, and we're going to be looking at Maine for a little bit here. And I'm going to invite you to start talking here.
So Matinicus, I've never been out there, but I used to work on that island Vinalhaven, which is about the closest island to Matinicus you can get to. And Matinicus always kind of intrigued me just from some of the stories I would hear out there. And plus, there was only like a year-round population of 50 or so people, even like to this day. And then when I started looking more into it, because of some of your things you would comment on about lighthouses, that really grabbed my attention about Matinicus's lighthouses, and some of the history on that didn't really seem to add up to me. And then it aligned with a lot of things I've heard, things that you've said and other people have said in other videos. I don't know, just the history of it. Like, Wikipedia is a really funny thing. I'll read it almost just to laugh at stuff sometimes. Like, that's a really good explanation you have there.
I find it to be a good starting point at what to find to look at and what we're told in the narrative. And totally agree with you. It can be pretty funny. So it's interesting that this, basically a big rock with the lighthouse on it, had a lot of attention paid to it. I really like getting a visual layout of where all of this is. And so we're looking at this area over here. And over here is Portland. And I just talked about Portland in a recent video. Lots of interesting stuff here. And I think we'll be able to get into some of that. The Popham colony was founded by the English in the same year as Jamestown in Virginia by the Virginia Company. And Popham didn't last very long. That was in 1607. For me, a lot of the anomalies in the narrative come around 1600, when King James I of England and VI of Scotland was made king of both in the Union of the Crowns in 1603. And to me, that seems like a red letter time period for all of this colonization rolling out and how they did it. And so I just wanted to bring that out because it's very interesting. And the Popham colony site didn't really do anything. It didn't last. And they were said to have built a star fort there in the year that they were there, when their population was declining and all of that. For a visual, this is Matinicus, right? And then the lighthouse is down here.
Right, there's the Matinicus Rock Lighthouse, and that's off of the actual island of Matinicus.
And you sent this Wikipedia article about it, if you want to talk about it a little bit.
I mean, again, when it comes to the Wikipedia explanation for it, for one, it's a very quick explanation for what must have really happened over a period of years. And also kind of sad. They were talking about the natives there, and then they were trying to get the natives off of there, and then, the natives were brutal trying to get these people off of their native land, which is a story we hear all the time, whether it's Australia has lots of stories like that. I mean, all around the world.
Yeah, it's interesting that we're not talking about the most accessible place in the world.
Right.
Why were they even there to begin with? What is it about Matinicus? And of course, with the lighthouse being there, that might be one explanation. Another thing, and hopefully as we go through this, we can talk more about what appears to be land just beneath the water, shallow here. And I have some major questions about what has been removed from our narrative, indicating that there may have been a landmass right here.
I heard in your last video that you were talking about continental shelves, and I remember learning about those when I was in school. But I think you might be onto something as far as like sunken land things are under the ocean that used to be able to get out to that island possibly. Like why would you build I can understand why you would build a lighthouse 25 miles out on an island. It would be good for ships, but is that really how it was way back when? Whenever? Was it really always an island out there? Or was it connected in the past?
So you sent me some information about the lighthouse on the big rock. It's like they have a story to explain everything, like this one. Built in 1846 for a little over $10,000. For whatever reason, they frequently have stories of something having been there previously, like earlier lighthouses or earlier courthouses or whatever the case may be. So these are later lighthouses in our narrative. The original wooden ones were torn down. The first dwelling remained, but was used as a storage shed. They've got plenty of detail.
Yeah, that's what I like about the whole mud flood theory is there's so many examples of them saying, "Oh, this building burnt, this building was moved," and just an example of those lighthouses. Oh, they tore down the original wooden ones and they made them slightly taller and slightly further apart. But then you ask yourself, when you look at the old pictures, like, did the lighthouses ever change, or have they always been in that same spot?
And then when I said earlier, there aren't supposed to be any megaliths in North America, you find them everywhere. And so in this illustration, you've got giant cut and shaped stones surrounding the lighthouse. Those are megaliths, but we don't see them that way because they're not supposed to be there. And once I woke up to that, I see them everywhere, and it doesn't matter where I am. I just want to go back to see how much of the lighthouse you can see now. There's not much in that picture. Maybe we'll come across another one. There really isn't much left anymore. Does it look like that now, Hans?
So I haven't been out there, but as far as I know, that is still what it looks like. That's what I was under the impression is that that's still what it looks like. And it's interesting to see the different rock work between the tower on one side and the other bigger lighthouse as far as the weathering and the slightly different style of how the rock was put together.
It definitely is. If the narrative is true, we had some really sophisticated building technology. Do we build like that today?
Right. And how long would it take to do that with today's technology compared to how hard it would have been to do that back in the early 1800s or whenever they said it was supposedly built?
And what's the weather like out there in Penobscot Bay, winter and summer?
The winters aren't terrible snow wise, but the wind and the tides are way worse in the winter. I worked on Vinalhaven mostly in the summer, but I did spend almost a whole winter out there. And snow wise, it's not bad, but cold and windy wise, it's pretty terrible. Vinalhaven's 17 miles out, and I believe Matinicus is about 25 miles out. But still, it's I know more about Vinalhaven's as far as that goes. Like I can understand why people were on Vinalhaven back then because of the rock quarries. Matinicus, the more of a mystery is why anyone would really want to try to survive out there.
And there's still people living there today?
Yes.
And you said they were pretty clannish.
Yeah, Matinicus, as far as I know, is still hovers around 50 to 60 year-round residents. In the last several years, some of the residents out there have tried to do an Airbnb thing, and from what I've heard, the other locals are all against it. There's been lots of stories about like do not approach Matinicus Island because you could get shot at. A sailboat going through the area that wants to visit Matinicus Island, it's advised not to do it because they don't want any people just coming by to check it out. I don't know what the big secret is, but I've heard you basically don't want to go out there unless you know someone that's out there and that can vouch for you when you come out, I guess. Vinalhaven's kind of similar to that. In my experience, I never had an issue, but I was definitely warned not to like mess with people or don't mess with the locals, don't stir up any trouble. A funny term on Vinalhaven is here in New Hampshire, we call people flatlanders when they come from further south. On Vinalhaven, they call people not from there, they just call them summer jerks. I always thought was kind of funny.
I think we're heading in the direction of Vinalhaven here in just a moment, so we'll go more into depth about that. And I know that's where you're most familiar with. So on Matinicus, a new bell tower with striking machinery was installed in 1867. In 1869, a steam-driven fog whistle, one of the first used anywhere, was installed, and the bell was retained as a backup signal. And again, you kind of wonder what we're really looking at here.
Yep, I thought that was interesting that they said that the steam whistle or the bell. I forget what that just said, but it was one of the first steam-driven fog whistle, one of the first used anywhere. I thought that was interesting that way out there in Matinicus, this little tiny island, we would have our one of the first used anywhere. Like, was that rediscovered technology? What was that?
That thought just came to mind, probably already there. We're going to get into the next place in West Penobscot Bay, Fox Islands and Vinalhaven.
Yeah, so Vinalhaven is part of the Fox Islands. There's another island called North Haven right beside Vinalhaven. And so the same ferry service that brings you out to Vinalhaven can also bring you to North Haven. Vinalhaven and North Haven are side by side islands. And then if you want to get out to Matinicus, it's like another 9 miles out to Matinicus from there. And the ferry only does it maybe 3 times a week in the summer and sometimes only once a month. They'll even go out to Matinicus in the wintertime because of the weather and the way the seas are.
So the landscape around here is looking pretty interesting and I imagine pretty rocky through there. Before we go into some slides about Vinalhaven, I want to ask you a question because I know this is all part of the Gulf of Maine and the Gulf of Maine is adjacent to the Bay of Fundy. And you're getting up into Nova Scotia. And I know the tides there are really extreme, like crazy extreme. So like low tide, all the boats are on mud. And then high tide, the water comes in and they're floating again. And I'm just curious whether or not you know the explanation for what causes that.
Well, Vinalhaven Harbor, the tide almost never goes low enough that any boats are beached like that. Like Vinalhaven's a big lobstering community. From the historical narrative, the reason why people were on the island was for the rock, for good granite from the quarries. But when the granite stuff started to fizzle out, it turned into a lobstering community, fishing community. The quarries on Vinalhaven really interest me. Like you can see the picture with the swimming quarries now. There's a picture later on in the slideshow, but of when I was out there just a week or two ago. And I didn't actually go in the water, but you can see how the quarry steps down. You can see how the rock steps down. And at the top above the water, I can see tool marks, the way that we still separate granite from to get chunks out of the quarry. But once it gets to the water's point, and even before that, you can't see any drill tool marks on it. And so one of my theories on that is that it's rediscovered quarries. And as part of the mud flood theory, like whatever cataclysm happened when we were digging out of stuff, whatever, it seems like they just refounded these quarries. And then they took all the easy pickings that were still there. Like around the world, you can see ancient sites around megalithic structures where there's still leftover stones that were cut, So it seems like somebody took advantage of what they found there. And then they did cut some more out of it in more modern ways with drilling the holes and maybe blasting it to get the granite to crack apart from it. But it seems like it was cut in a different way than the modern way that we do it before that. And then my big question with those swimming hole quarries is, from what I can remember reading, they say it's just because they're freshwater quarries, 17 miles out in the ocean. And they don't say they hit a water vein when they got to the bottom of the quarry, and that's what made it fill up with fresh water 17 miles out. From what I remember, they said it just filled up with rainwater over time. And I wonder how many hundreds of years that might have taken for that much rainwater to come in. And if that is the explanation, how come the quarry stays at the same level? Because it's been almost 10 years since the last time I was out there, and I've never seen the quarry at a different level. So you can't really explain that with, the rain just filled the quarry up because they stopped using it. That's a question I have about that.
Those are really good questions, and I think it speaks to a lot of missing information about what the surface of the earth was like prior to whatever happened. And with regards to the quarries, one of the thoughts that I've had is maybe this was megalithic stone infrastructure prior to that. And that's the opportunistic taking what's easy to get from what were original stone buildings or walls or whatever. Because our narrative is this was all inhabited by wild Indians. So they're not building this stuff, but they've removed all of that information about the original builders of civilization and who was actually here. And that this megalithic building or megalithic construction was all over the earth. But it's most well known in places like Britain and South America and Turkey and places like that, but it's really all over.
They seem to have got it's easy for us to explain away buildings over in Europe and all around the world, but as far as what we were taught for our history in America, it doesn't add up, the buildings that were there. And even on Vinalhaven, the oldest pictures you can find of it, it's like it was pretty well laid out. It seems like it would have taken a lot of motivation for people to go out and just set up this island and even to get started on a project like doing those quarries. And I mean, all around Maine, those quarries exist too, and in New Hampshire and Vermont. But it always kind of fascinated me out on Vinalhaven. And they have some of the best like pink granite. I believe you mentioned that in one of your last videos. In my years of working out there, I worked for a guy that he worked for so many different people that we were allowed to go on their property. And so the quarries that you see that are filled with water, those are public quarries now. But I went on at least 3 or 4 quarries on private property, and those were dry quarries. And some of them were the pink granite and black granite quarries. And that always kind of fascinated me. Like, what makes the granite pink or black or regular granite? Like, I'm from New Hampshire, which we're called the granite state, so we have lots of granite here, but some of the best granite comes from Maine, and some of the best granite comes specifically from Vinalhaven, Maine. And it ties into New York City too, because a lot of this granite ended up getting shipped to New York City. Apparently, that's what it says. You might remember some of the pictures of the carved eagles, the granite eagles I sent you. And they're still on some of the big buildings in New York City. I can't remember the names of them, but that also makes me wonder, like, what was really going on? Like, did they refine these quarries and there was still a couple of those carved eagles sitting on the island? There's still a single one on Vinalhaven on Main Street, but I can't remember the building in New York City, but supposedly that's what they made all those eagles for, was for this one specific building. But that's just the narrative we're told.
In the research I was doing on Vermont, I found they're known for marble, high quality marble in Vermont. It would not surprise me if they were just harvesting original buildings and this is good stuff kind of thing. It's just interesting.
This picture, I really like the one with the single guy sitting on the paver stones.
Oh, this one right here?
And he's got his one little shanty tent there. And I don't know if you can read it easier than me, but I just love what it says underneath it.
Something like typical Maine paving block quarry called a motion, operated by one man, provided with a tent, rarely with very small hand derrick.
I just think that is funny. To me, it looks like they found these leftover paver blocks, and that's his little tent for shade, to get out of the sun. But they're trying to say, oh, yeah, this guy kind of lives here under his little tent and puts his little paver blocks on a wagon and brings them down to the coastline, and that's how he makes a living. I don't know. It's just kind of a stupid story to me. I feel bad saying that sometimes because I understand the people that live on Vinalhaven are pretty proud of their heritage, and so I feel bad laughing at a headline like that, but to me, it just doesn't add up.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things like that. I came across Vinalhaven when I was researching the star forts in that area. And a lot of the star forts there were said to have had the granite come from Vinalhaven. And so that was my first exposure to it. Again, the star forts that they're building in a year, 1607, 1623. Stories are shaky.
Since you bring up star forts, that's also kind of a newer thing for me to look into. I've always heard about them over the last few years and stuff, but I think you mentioned that they also call them batteries sometimes. Mm-hmm. Batteries. And I know that a lot of stuff like military, maybe Civil War, they call these forts that were built for military thing, and they call them batteries too. So I think that ties into the natural grid system around the world. And also I liked how you brought up golf courses, and that really does lay out when you look at golf courses around, but how you mentioned that they're called links. Mm-hmm. I have lots of golf courses around where I live, and one of them is called Highland Links, and they always call them links. Go hit the links. But I think you're right that they help link power from one area to another. That makes sense to me, or they used to anyways.
And since we're touching on this, so there's lighthouses, star forts all through here. And I'm theorizing that whatever caused a cataclysm went through the grid system, which included the star forts and the lighthouses, which is why you find them built in these odd locations. And star forts, too, typically are on like an island. And my thought is that some kind of directed energy went through this, and then the land just sank around them. And so whatever the lighthouse was being used for originally, which I theorize is like a light energy of some kind, turned into navigational aids because now they were next to the water where they weren't necessarily next to water before. And they've got all this land around that's jagged and dangerous, and so they needed it for that. But that's certainly not what came down to our narrative. They were built as navigational aids.
I think you're right about that, and that all ties in like to the whole mud flood theory. I almost like using the reset theory term better now, but mud flood is just more convenient to use. But as far as the whole like liquefaction, like how did the mud flood even occur? I've watched other stuff you've put out in videos, and it does seem like it was kind of a big meltdown of the whole grid system, whether it was all at once or different areas around the world. But it did seem to liquefaction, I guess is the word, but something major happened that even rock couldn't handle, or
Yeah, that's kind of where I've landed after looking at all of this for quite a few years. And I think there was probably more than one type of directed energy, but I think it was worldwide, which is why we see the devastation worldwide. And then whoever was behind it came in and set up their new system. This is an interesting area that you directed my attention to because it's like a really good example of what I've been looking at and talking about. And what's the name of, I'm blanking out, but around Portland, Casco Bay, is that it?
Yep. Portland itself, I went there a month or two ago, and I've been there a number of times, but I never really walked around like I did. And it's just amazing, some of the buildings in downtown Portland. And like as I was going around, I was looking up the Wikipedia pages on these buildings and just kind of laughing at like the explanation of it, just like you always see, like, oh, started building in 1899, finished in 1900. It's like, I've seen houses in my area that take 3 years to build, let alone this giant cathedral church, and things like that just don't add up to me. Or that picture you were just showing of that giant stone, that's on Vinalhaven. I'm pretty sure it's still there. I'm pretty sure that's the rock that it stood by. And I do see tool marks on the very far end here, but it looks like they just did that to break off chunks off the end. I don't necessarily believe they cut out that chunk of stone. It seems like that's why they posed for that picture, because it was such an enormous feat of engineering to even cut a block like that, especially back then.
And that brings to mind the enormous stone in Baalbek in Lebanon. It's like the largest megalithic stone in the world. And then there's another one like that off of Taylor Head in Nova Scotia, which isn't too far from there. It's the same idea. Again, it's not matching. And another thing is the Poor Farm that's mentioned down at the bottom, the American road trip inhabiting the Poor Farm in conjunction with this article. Poor farms were kind of like insane asylums, maybe not as bad, but they had all of these poor people that they wanted to put to work. And they were quite common during the 19th and early 20th centuries. So what's up with that? I've looked into insane asylums a bit more than poor farms, but poor farms come up too in the research that I do.
Well, so an interesting thing too with the lighthouses and insane asylums, like I've looked into the insane asylum thing quite a bit, but I was also looking more into lighthouses recently because of things that you've mentioned. They say people that tended the lighthouses tend to go mad. They tend to be insane. One of the things I read was that there used to be a big bowl of mercury, and I forget if they said it was lead or something in the center of the bowl of mercury, but that is what used to produce the light for the lighthouse. And so that is why the lighthouse keepers would go mad, because of mercury poisoning. Something I randomly came across recently reading about a certain lighthouse. I forget where it was, but I saved it all. I meant to send it to you. But
So these pictures are really interesting, Hans. Early Vinalhaven.
it's got the obelisk and the church.
This here really looks mud flooded.
Yep.
Some of these pictures in here, this one looks more mud flooded than this one and this one. And then you find these buildings down on the bottom row here. That's the style of architecture that you find all over the earth also. But I thought that one was pretty positive for mud flood right there, especially. Then the roads, of course, are dirt covered and the electric wires.
Mm-hmm. And I believe that church is still there, but it definitely looks mud flooded. And a lot of Main Street, Vinalhaven, looks mud flooded. The rest of it is kind of woods with houses, but Main Street, most of the buildings on there seem like they've been there for a while. Not the wooden ones so much, but any of the older brick ones definitely reminds me of mud flood situation. And I understand construction, and that's why the whole mud flood theory intrigues me the most. because buildings in the next town over from me and all across New Hampshire, it's just, I can find example after example after example, and I can show people the difference. Like, yeah, I know how brick buildings are done. I know they still do basement windows, but explain to me why. You obviously know the examples, but you can see the windows changing as you go down the hill, and you can see where there used to be windows, and sometimes they're barred up, sometimes they're bricked in. And once you see it, it's hard to unsee. It's also hard to explain to people if they don't understand, but
That's another thing I find everywhere. And when we accept it as normal, that's how they built. And
yeah.
there's more questions than answers as to what you just said. I mean, why one end of the street there's this much wall showing, and other end of the street it's like you can see the whole thing. So definitely some explaining to do, and can't find it in the narrative. It's like, oh, that's how it always was. I really like this one. Do you know anything about it?
So I know they call that machine a gallimander. It's spelled like salamander, but with a G, gallimander. And there's still one of the original ones on Vinalhaven, kind of in the center of town. That's what they used to explain how they moved some of those bigger rocks. Like picture that big rock with all the people standing in it in one of the last slides. Like they say, oh, that's how we moved all the granite rocks. But I've yet to see a picture with a block not much bigger than 2 bales of hay, call it, like 4 feet long by maybe 4 feet tall, square rectangle block. And it's usually got at least 4 to 6 horses moving a block like that. So imagine what it would take to move some of these way bigger chunks of granite. I think what they were doing was breaking off pieces of it and moving it, compared to moving some of the giant blocks that you see in like a picture like one you just saw with all the men standing on top of it. And
Yeah.
that's what I was trying to remember. Also, the pine barrens, is that what you call it? The guys with the top hats. So in a lot of these old pictures, including that giant chunk of granite that had all the guys standing on, it looked like there was a pine barren looking person at the front, in charge of all of the laborers. And you see that commonly in all these old pictures. And the pictures also look a little staged to me, like when it comes to old Civil War photos, I'm starting to wrap my head around that more too, where a lot of it looks staged. And what really did happen during the Civil War? Was it really these crazy, brutal battles, or was it more of a photo shoot and something else was going on in the background for our history books that indoctrinate us all and believe that happened or whatever?
Yeah, lots of questions. And I've seen those staged photos too. Got I guess they're called bowler hat guys, like you said. Maybe a group of young guys hanging out with their equipment or whatever. And like you said, you see them with the Civil War and other things as well. And I've seen some really creepy pictures.
And if you look at a lot of photos from the mid 1800s, the look on people's faces, it's like something crazy had happened in their lifetime, whether they were young when it happened or whatever. But people definitely have a look on their face like they went through hell before these pictures were taken, whether it was 20 years before or when it was. But people have a different look on their face. And definitely some of the people are look wicked creepy, but there's not much smiling. And if you look at people's eyes in these old photos, you can just see it in their eyes. Like,
And the kicker is, this wasn't that long ago. Whoever we're looking at these pictures could have been a generation or two removed from us. It was not that long ago. And that gets in the category of really hard to explain.
yeah. Well, that's what I think is the hardest thing to wrap. Like, even for me, like I said, whether it's my own cognitive dissonance or whatever, but I think everybody has that to an extent. It's hard to believe something that's so far out from what you were taught your whole life. But when you really start looking at it like you do and like many others do, it just leaves you with more questions than answers. And that's what keeps you going down the rabbit hole of it. But I was fine with, not knowing what really happened with the pyramids. But when it came to what really happened in 1700s to 1800s and especially early 1900s, I'm like, well, that's my great grandparents or great great grandparents generation. Like, what did they go through that brought us to here? And how did everyone get so indoctrinated that we don't know the real history? And that kind of ties back into insane asylums and even the orphan train thing. I kind of want to bring that up to you because my grandfather was supposedly an orphan, at least for a short time. But there's always a story I remember from when I was a kid that he had to spend a Christmas at the orphanage, and him and all the boys in the orphanage, they all asked for model train set for Christmas. That's what every boy wanted in this orphanage. And what they ended up getting was one model train for all the boys in the orphanage to share. And my grandfather was always upset about that because he wanted his own model train. And so it was almost like a lesson for me and my siblings, like, you gotta be thankful at Christmas because you're a spoiled brat if you're upset you didn't get the gift you wanted. But think about what your grandfather had to do. He had to share his train with all the other boys in the orphanage. But what really stuck out in my mind was when I started learning about the orphan trains, I'm like, well, why was it that every boy wanted to train? Is it because they all came here on a train? The train was the coolest thing they'd seen up until the time they got to this orphanage. It just stood out in my mind. And I've seen enough on the orphan trains that something was definitely going on there too.
Yeah. That started about 1854 and lasted for about 75 years. And children would go into these towns. Some organizing committee would have them in a theater or some common place, and people would come look at them and decide which one they wanted. And I guess they would go from place to place. If they were lucky, they found a good home, I would imagine. But I don't think that the process was so vetted that everybody was guaranteed that. And like yourself, I do have a lot of questions about that. And just have to wonder if it was an early, I want to say child trafficking, but I think there were probably multiple uses for it. One would be repopulation, and then whatever else, bringing these kids without any connection to a new location that needed to be repopulated and rebuilt or whatever was going on during that time. So that's another area of study that, it's not an easy one. And my husband's great Gibson grandfather was a orphan after the Civil War. That's all they knew, from a place called Dora, Alabama. And he went west and ended up with a man named Gibson on a cattle drive that took him to Oklahoma, western Oklahoma. And so that's where they landed. And that's where his family's from, his dad's family. I, on the other hand, have a lineage that goes back a ways. And that's one of the questions that come up. How come some people have that and some people don't? And even on my mom's side of the family, my mom loves genealogy and my uncle likes genealogy a lot. And their immediate ancestor showed up in Florida in 1830. So that would have been right around this time period. And they were founders of this particular county in Florida. And it's just really a lot of questions. I mean, somebody knew what was going on. And that information did not get communicated to their descendants. So their descendants think it was all horse and buggy and wood houses and hard living. But what was really going on?
Yeah. And it definitely split up a lot of families, the orphan train thing. And I don't know. I know I'm from a small town, but I know several other families that kids that I grew up with, either their grandmother or grandfather was adopted. And it just seems like there was a lot of adoption going on back then. Why was it so common, And then that also changed people's last names and everything. So it's like, oh, did I really come from this family or that family or what? But yeah, we're getting a little off subject.
No, all good questions. And I think it's all related. And the size of those wheels in those pictures there just really blow my mind to the Galamander. It's like, I wonder what the original use of that would have been for.
The one that they still have up there too, it's meant to carry like one chunk of granite kind of in the center in between the big wheel and the little wheel. And the block of granite is in between there. And I've seen other things that you might see in some of these other pictures, but where they would have oxen going around in circles, and there'd be one like center pole with like 8 cables coming off it, each one connected to an oxen, and they would be trained to walk around in a circle. And as they walked around in a circle, it would pull chunks of block up out of the quarry. So I do believe that they had ways of moving stuff like this, but I find it hard to believe that they really cut a lot of this stuff out, especially like way down. Like some of those water quarries are like 200 feet deep, those swimming quarries that are out there. I don't know. It would be a massive amount of work for us to do today, let alone back then.
Cool finds, Hans. That was new to me. So your thoughts on the bird's eye view of Vinalhaven?
So I was looking at this again yesterday, and it kind of confuses me how built out it is. And when I zoomed in, it's hard for me to picture like being on the island nowadays. And I don't know, I almost questioned whether this was an actual depiction of Vinalhaven, but like the lower picture, if that's from 1893, that is very built out for back then. And I love these old bird's eye view maps of all around New Hampshire, and you can, you go on Google Images and it really shows the grid system. Like if there was a natural grid, like people that talk about Earth being a circuit board and stuff like that, these these old bird's eye view image photos that you can easily find on Google Images just shows every town laid out in very perfect lines. Doesn't make any sense. We don't do that nowadays in the small town. We don't make it a perfect grid. Everything's got a curved driveway and this and that, but it's like every town and city seemed to have been already laid out. If you look at New York City, that was laid out very nicely, and people say, oh, that's why New York's better because it's laid out in a grid, and that's why Boston, Massachusetts, a pain in the ass because it's not all laid out right. But if you look at these older photos, it seems like everything was kind of laid out like that. And I feel like it was more for a natural power grid system that we don't even understand today. But, we kind of built our roads on top of it and set up our cities because it was more convenient that way. But we forgot the initial purpose of why it was all laid out in that certain way.
And the other thing that comes to mind is if the Wright brothers didn't invent the airplane until the 1900s, how are they getting these bird's eye views in 1893 and even earlier than that?
That question really gets me too. When I question people on that, they don't really know what to say. I'm like, was it from a hot air balloon? Kind of imagining it. And, I mean, we could go into the airships type stuff, but it seems to me it's not even like depictions or drawings. A lot of them, it's like someone took a picture of this. Is what it looks like to me, but it's really hard to tell.
So these are some of the anomalies out there to find for anybody that's interested in looking. And I just want to interject. What I really want people to take away from presentations like Hans and other people is I really encourage people to do their own research and looking into things with their own discernment and just start asking questions. Don't go with what anybody says as gospel, myself included, or anybody else, because it's confusing time right now with people looking for information and so much information out there. But if you just start looking at things differently, there's a lot of anomalies like Hans is finding in this area that he knows really well. It's just all around us, and we don't have to go very far to look for this.
Yep. So I took this picture from the ferry on the way out, and that's the breakwater lighthouse coming out of Rockland, Maine, heading towards Vinalhaven. So we just barely took off on the ferry. But yeah, that straight line leading out to the lighthouse. I know you have another picture coming up in the slide, but that's quite a stretch out there. And you read the history on that too, and it's kind of funny that they wanted to make two breakwaters and they decided just to leave that one breakwater. Again, kind of like talking about sunken land, and was it always like that? Or
Food for thought, for sure.
oh, the bricks. So I've been going up to my grandmother's cottage just outside of Rockland, Maine all my life. I was almost born up there actually. And this was just a quick walk around the rocky beach out front, and I found several of these ones, and the one in the background actually almost looks like it was brick pottery or something. It's got that had like a smoother finish on the inside. You can see it's a little bit darker, but for the most part, I've found them over the years. They're just rounded off bricks. It looks like it's rock, and you can even hear it. I know what bricks sound like when you clink them together. And I think I wrote a question to you when I sent you that picture. Just I wonder how long it would take for like that center brick to wear down. Like how many years would it take a brick rolling around, tumbling around the rocks to get worn down to a nice rounded edge? And just wondering if there's older structures that have been sunken in the ocean and older bricks have been coming along. I know other people look into brickology and meltology and stuff like that. It's kind of a new subject, but I really do wonder how many years it would take for a brick in the ocean tumbling around through natural erosion or whatever to actually get smooth and finished off like that.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. That looks interesting too.
So that was right outside the Historical Society on Vinalhaven as I was walking in. And it's got a book in the center there that's opened up, and it looks like to the left of the book is another book with the pages kind of open, and it's kind of eroded enough that it actually looks like someone might have found that in the ocean and then donated it to the Historical Society. I don't think it came off of a building around there, but it's hard to see exactly what the symbolic other things are carved in there other than the book in the center and what looks to be a book off to the side. But I thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, there's a lot of markings and workings on here. No telling what that is.
Like that was maybe carved out to be part of a detail on a building, above a column or something like you would see. But it does seem like it had been in the ocean for a while and someone dragged it up out and donated it to the Historical Society, and they just put it out by the front door.
Clearly not natural. And that's what they do. I mean, this stuff is all around us. It's just sitting there. And
Yeah.
unless you pay attention to it and start asking questions, it's just there. This is an extremely interesting photo. Did you get this at the Historical Society?
Yep, and there's a bit of glare in there. All the pictures I took inside the Historical Society, they were either framed or wrapped in whatever plastic. So, and the lights were so bright, there was a lot of glare. But I liked this one. I'm glad you put it in here because it shows about the size chunk of granite that they would be moving with 4 strong oxen or whatever. But when you think about some of the bigger giant blocks, even with that Gallimander piece of machinery, they're not moving something much bigger than what you're seeing in that picture. You'd have to have 12 oxen to move something 3 times the size of that kind of.
And you've got the dirt covered road here, the guys hanging around over here, the oxen driver, I guess that would be broken stone blocks. I see the glare from the rest of the room over here, but there's still enough showing here that you can kind of get an idea about what conditions were like there.
And some of it, there's rails going on some of it where they're just, hauling stuff from the quarry to the ship on the shore. But when I see the rail and all the dirt around it and everything, it just reminds me of other mud flood situations where they dug away probably existing railway and used what they could. And whoever refounded these quarries and all this rock that a lot of it was probably already cut up just took advantage of it and had a way of making money off it. And I'm sure a lot of locals up there would not like my opinion on that because that's kind of their heritage. But to me, it just, when you look at the big picture on not just Vinalhaven, but all around New England and all around the US and all around the world, similar things were going on everywhere. Maybe your great grandfather was a quarryman, but they might not have sawed out those giant granite blocks.
The railroads are pretty significant because, like I said, it's the same story. So sometime in the 1800s, they built the railroad to mine or quarry or whatever was going on, harvest timber, coal, and iron ore. And then when it was all exhausted, they didn't need the railroad anymore and they took out the tracks and whatever else. And so why do all of that for that little bit of use? Very basic question. They just got it up and running as long as they needed it. And then when they didn't need it anymore, they discontinued it and for all intents and purposes removed the tracks.
Yeah, and if you read about it too, I can remember reading that, like you were just saying, they used it for what they could, and then they had hundreds of men that they were putting to work for years, and then they would have to have labor strikes, and then all said and done, whoever was the boss of this whole thing just laid off all the workers and basically didn't give a shit that put all these people to work and made them work their asses off, and no, now we don't need you anymore. And then I think that's kind of how Vinalhaven evolved into a fishing community was, all right, we kind of got left for dead on the granite thing. No one's paying to ship this granite out of here anymore. So out of necessity, it turned into a fishing community.
And the thing about any strikes for better working conditions, they were put down brutally by the owners, business owners. Typically, in some cases, some places I've looked at, they brought in the military or the strike breakers or whatever. So, I mean, people could not, they wanted to work, they could not protest the working conditions, which oftentimes were quite dangerous. Any thoughts on that one?
To me, it just gives you an idea of what size chunk of granite they were able to move. That size block right there compared to some of the giant blocks that they say they shipped all the way to these. I wish I knew the names of the buildings in places like New York City, but Vinalhaven's kind of famous for, they still take the claim to fame for some of these crazy granite structures and columns on some of these big buildings in New York City and elsewhere. But it makes me wonder, especially because we know the whole timeline's kind of weird. The narrative's weird. Like, I don't doubt that the granite these buildings have in New York City, some of them, I'm sure it did come from Vinalhaven, but I don't think it was from this time period. I think they were still shipping whatever granite they could, but in smaller chunks. I feel like Vinalhaven might be an ancient site that did produce granite for some of these buildings that survived the whole mud flood time period, but I don't think the people in these pictures were the ones that supplied the granite for those buildings. And I don't even know if they were shipped on these types of ships. It would have taken a lot. And why would you? I mean, there's closer places in New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont that you could just stay on land. And I know shipping might have been easier, if you got the right boats and everything, and having that amount of weight, it might be faster to ship it. But again, that'd just be quite an undertaking to me.
another thing that doesn't quite add up. And it seems like with the human psyche, if we see a picture of something, we believe it. And so there's a lot of pictures out there telling us the story. Oh, there's a picture. That must be true. There's a construction picture. They must have built that. And that's caused more of the cognitive dissonance and just general confusion about, well, maybe they did build it when they said they did.
I think this is a picture that I took, right? I think if you skip to the next one, you might be able to see the tool marks a little bit. Yeah, so you can see the straight line of granite that's under the water. When I was there, I couldn't see any tool marks on that. And then the next kind of stair step up, next two stair steps up, you can't really see the same type of drill holes you naturally see in granite the way we do it now. But then if you look at the top of the screen and then down to the next step, those two top ones, you can see the drill marks, where that's still kind of how we do it nowadays on granite. Yeah, exactly. That's drill marks. Then you go down to the next one, you can see the drill marks along that one.
Yeah, right here.
Yep. But then once you go past that and then down in the water, I didn't see any evidence of that. And you couldn't really blame it on erosion from the water, like moving to get rid of those tool marks down there, because I mean, it's a calm freshwater quarry. It's not like a river rolling through there or ocean salt water bashing up against it all the time. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. Like, I wish I had had more time to walk around the quarry. But to me, little things like that kind of show you, like, well, how come this was a nice straight cut down this whole thing and you don't see the tool marks? And yes, I can see how they took away these upper parts, but because that was easy picking once they found the quarry, kind of in my mind. But back to old megalithic structures, that's what people point out. The things like the pyramids and stuff is like, where's the tool marks? What were they cutting it with,
A great example of the straight edges, something the current narrative doesn't do a really good job of explaining, like you're saying. Okay, so the next one, you sent me some information about the Rockland Breakwater Lighthouse.
Yep, and I've walked out there before when I was a kid. I meant to when I was up there a week ago, but we didn't have time. Interesting to look at what's underneath this top layer. Like, I can see tool marks on some of this granite on top. As far as the foundation of this, like, I don't know, with the work that you do, like with more of the ley lines and looking for star forts and stuff, I wonder if this is part of something or what the deal is. But either way, it's quite a feat just to have, like, I forget how long that is from the actual shore out there, but it's quite a ways.
So they want to tell us the cost estimate was $500,000. One portion extended 1,900 feet from the shore at Jameson Point, and the other section extending 2,640 feet from the south ledge back towards the point with the original plan. Now, this is giving us date of sometime around 1886 and deciding on the one long breakwater, and that it was approved in 1890 and completed in November 24th of 1899. And then severe winter storms during the winter of 1899 to 1900 proved that the height needed to be increased. A 4-foot high cap was completed on October 15th, 1901, and included the base for a lighthouse to be built at the end. And so they're getting up close to $1 million in 1901-ish dollars. But again, they're giving us these long, elaborate explanations for this infrastructure.
And I'm kind of surprised that they even put estimated cost of $500,000, because sometimes they'll put such low numbers. It's like, oh, well, for $10,000, we put 768,774 tons of granite for that amount of money. The Wikipedia stories are laughable a lot of times, whether building dates, start to completion dates, and the amount of funding and this and that. It's all across the board, especially in this time period, especially anywhere from 1850 to 1900. It just doesn't seem feasible, and also doesn't make sense. Like, you and others talk about, like, well, this lines up with World War I or the Civil War or the Great Depression. It's like, who had time or money to even be doing this? Or were we just explaining away something that we found? And that's why they call it founded or refounded.
Time period you mentioned, 1850 to 1900, was very, 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 very busy in terms of this construction. that was supposed to be happening, and very
Yeah.
sophisticated construction. And the Industrial Revolution started somewhere in between 1850 and 1900. So they're doing these incredible feats of engineering, in many cases pre-Industrial Revolution or around the time of the Civil War, or, we're not supposed to have that kind of technology. They have to account for it all. So apparently we were doing amazing things with hand tools and horseback.
Yeah, sometimes I bring this stuff up to people and they're just like, well, people were tougher back then. They worked harder back then and stuff like that, or they had more time on their hands. And I'm just like, is that really an excuse to explain it away? I know lots of hardworking people. I know lots of people that might have enough time on their hands and are ambitious, but just across the board, across the nation, across the world, why? It seems more like it was rediscovering things that were already there a lot, and we've tried to mimic things that we'd already found, and some people are good at that, but some of it just is obviously old world stuff, and it doesn't line up with the history that we were taught. And yes, the alignments of the lighthouse, you really got me started on this, like the lunar alignments or whatever you want to call it, with the moon rising right with these lighthouses, especially with certain moons and certain types of years and during certain cycles. It's just amazing, or too much of a coincidence that so many lighthouses have this same alignment. I was trying to remember where these two are, because that's different.
California. These two are in California.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
that's in Maine. And one of the many reasons I don't think these were originally navigational aids, because not only lighthouses, but cathedrals and state capitol buildings and, churches and mosques worldwide have these incredible alignments going on. Full moon, crescent moon, eclipse. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's like there's some kind of perfect alignment going on with these structures like lighthouses, indicating to me there was a very different purpose for them.
Right. There's a reason for it. It's not by accident. Great pyramids in Egypt were one of the things that stuck out in my mind early on before I started going down all these rabbit holes. But, how they aligned with different constellations. I can't even think of the right one right now. But in the same way that the pyramids are lined up perfectly for a reason, these lighthouses and other buildings and other structures are lined up for a reason too. That wasn't by accident that the moon rises perfect at all these different lighthouses, time of year and different cycles that it happens. But, how did they know that? Who knows? But it was for a purpose, obviously.
Whoever built it knew exactly what they were doing and where they were. The civilization was mirroring what was going on in the heavens and vice versa at all times. Even what we think are natural formations, it's the same kinds of things going on. So now we're moving into the last section on Livermore Falls in New Hampshire, which is kind of in your neck of the woods.
Yep. I grew up 15 minutes away from this spot. I went to high school right past where this is. And they just recently turned it into a state park, which is interesting because they tend to do that with old places, as you know, that of significance. They turn them into national parks or state parks. But it's pretty recent that they turned Livermore Falls into a state park. I kind of love that first paragraph there that's highlighted. And big part of what I sent you too about this is nobody wants to claim the Pumpkin Seed Bridge. We call it the trestle at Livermore Falls. People jump off it. You're not supposed to. It's a very high bridge, and it's on the border of two towns on one side and on the border of my town on the other side. So the bridge actually touches three towns and touches Campton, Plymouth, and Holderness. And none of the three towns want to claim ownership to it. And they also don't really know who built it. They kind of tell you like where the steel came from, but they don't tell you who actually built it or exactly when it was built. And the interesting thing to me was that nobody out of the three towns, no one wants to claim ownership of it. And just recently, since it became a state park, the state park will not claim ownership to it. So even the whole state of New Hampshire will not claim ownership to it. And the reason they give, which I understand, is there's been a lot of deaths off of that bridge over the years. Like when I was a kid, I wasn't even supposed to go there because one of my parents' friends died as a kid going off of that bridge. Trestle, we call it. Yep, that one. But that really stuck out to me when I saw one of your videos about all the old swing bridges. And like, this is another hard one for me to wrap my head around. Hard to wrap your head around brick buildings and the whole mud flood theory. But when it comes to old steel buildings and railroad systems, people can explain that one way easily, like, well, yeah, we still do steel bridges and stuff. But to me, it does seem like some of this stuff was already here and refound. And this bridge in particular is kind of a rare one. That's why they call it the pumpkin seed bridge, because they usually don't do it in a shape like that. But a lot of weird history to it, and it's just surprising that no one wants to claim it.
And I have done some extensive research looking at the co-location and correlation of these gorges and bridges and rail lines. And it says there's a rail line here as well, rapids, hydroelectric plants. And I've gathered a lot of data to show that this was part of the energy grid and the energy generation system, these gorges and rapids and falls, and it was clean, free energy. And talking about the bridge, an abandoned road, it's not even used anymore, right? It was built in 1885, and they managed to get a Berlin Iron Bridge Company of East Berlin, Connecticut. And a lot of times they say builder unknown for these old bridges. Don't know the rehab date. They can give you basic information, but if you start looking into the old bridge data, it's pretty interesting because there's a lot of holes. And talking about the waterfalls as an important source of hydropower for the various mills located along this area of river after the closure of the last mills. Floods and storms have reduced the falls to an area of small rapids and are no longer visible within the park boundaries. Kind of getting back to this was originally a system of some kind, and they acknowledged and used for hydropower. And then I find the highway routes to be very interesting as well. They were connected to the system. I think maybe originally giant tree roots, which was part of the system. We don't even know that they were there anymore. So that's a harder one to prove, but I know a lot of people are interested in that topic. And I think a lot of old railway routes became highway routes. And that may have been the case with Route 175. I haven't looked into it, but
Also, off of Route 175, I was reading something recently that one of the roads they tore up, the old railroad, for scrapping for, I don't know if it was during World War II or whatever, but it just seemed kind of funny to me that they would go out and do all that work to tear up a perfect rail line just for scrap, and the amount of work it would take to make that in the first place to replace it. But kind of getting off subject, but what I was thinking was also off of this Pemigewasset, that's where I noticed a lot of the Oxbow Lake stuff, which I remember mentioning that to you, and you said it does seem like there's something significant about Oxbow Lakes and the rerouting of rivers and our natural power system that used to work. And it did create a lot of these Oxbow Lakes and things like that that doesn't serve the purpose of what the natural way used to be.
It seems like the bends, those river bends, had some kind of important function. And so whatever they did to create the oxbows by cutting off the bend from the watercourse was probably done deliberately. So yeah, the Oxbow Lakes, I think, were important in that respect. I think that's that's the last slide that I have. But I mean, there's a lot of information here, and I didn't even put in everything that you sent me, in terms of things that would be interesting to research, particularly around New Hampshire.
Yeah, I sent you a lot of stuff all across the board, some of it, but some of it was just those bird's eye view photos from 1890s you can easily find on Google Images. And for anyone who's kind of interested in this, like, look up your own town. And what I'll do on Google Images is I'll write the area and I'll write historical 1700s photos, even though there's no photos from them. That'll get you the oldest images to pop up, So I find that's a little trick to do sometimes. If you look for something for early 1900s, you're going to get stuff from a little too modern. You type in 1800s, you might get early 1900s, but you type in 1700s, you might actually get some of the earliest depictions of stuff or whatever. But those bird's eye view stuff and the layouts of different areas that it shouldn't be laid out like that back then, that really intrigues me and goes along with what you and others talk about with the natural grid system that must have already been there. And that ties into golf courses and oval track speedways and football stadiums and baseball fields and all that stuff. You start looking into some of this stuff, and at first it seemed pretty crazy to me, like the whole things are laid out like a circuit board. But when you start seeing some of those bird's eye view photos from 1890s, it's like, well, oh my God, this oval was already there, before NASCAR was started. Where this stadium still is, that was already there. Where this golf car course is, that was kind of already laid out.
Once you're aware of all of this information, it's overwhelming. The sheer amount of things to look at and investigate. And like you're finding, Hans, these are places that you grew up and know really well. And I'm 61 now. I was in probably my late 40s, early 50s. Let's say late 40s, mid to late 40s, when I started to wake up to it. So I spent 2/3 of my life not seeing it.
Yeah.
And, that's
It's
typical.
it's never ending. I'm glad that you've given me a chance to even talk or even just respond through emails over the last several months. But I understand how never ending it is, and the amount of research you've done is crazy, and what others have done, like yourself. But yeah, even for me, the amount of things that I've screenshotted over the last several months that I haven't even gone back through. Because once you start looking into something, it's like, oh my God, well, now this is interesting. Now this is interesting. And it just, one thing leads to another, and you lose track of where you've been unless you stay focused on a certain area. Once you start to see it, you can't unsee it. And it just makes it all the more interesting. And I'm glad I live in the state that I do. New Hampshire is not very big, but there is so much old mud flood style buildings. It's just endless. Every time I go anywhere, like when I went to Portland, Maine recently, I just walking around this city at 3 in the morning after the concert I was at, I was just amazed and typing things into my phone, looking up the history of these buildings. If I drive through Concord, New Hampshire, which is the capital, or Manchester, New Hampshire, which has a big canal going down the center and giant brick old mill factory buildings, and you start to look at some of that stuff, and it really adds up to the things you and others have been pointing out from all around the US, but New Hampshire has a lot of it. I could spend a year doing a full tour just going around New Hampshire and pointing things out and going to historical societies and being like,
Well, I'm really glad that you reached out to me last year, and you're welcome to keep sending information. This format's working really well. I like getting it, but I think it works well to have the people that are sending it talk about it. I can
Yeah,
do a relatively good job of starting to piece it together, but there's a lot more backstory and context. And so welcome to do this again sometime with me if you'd like. And like I said, just also keep sending me and put it in a file, and we'll do it again sometime.
yeah, I appreciate it, Michelle. And as we've been talking, I had so many other ideas of different things. So I'll definitely send you a few things that have been popping in my mind. And just recently, I downloaded this like 400-page PDF about electric railways across the United States. And you may have seen a bunch on this, but they lay it right out that all these rails were run off electric. And then they were starting to bring in the coal and steam engines, but it was electric before that for most of them. But I'll definitely send you some stuff on that.
That would be really cool. I definitely think that the original system was free energy electromagnetic system, and when they knocked it out, they had to replace it as quickly as possible. And that's where we
Yeah.
got the coal and all these other gas and whatnot. So they had to get it up and running for their new economic system. But yeah, this all helps. And anybody that is interested in doing this kind of thing, get in touch with me. And it really takes all of us. And like you say, there's a lot of really good researchers out there. And thankfully, we have the tools to do this now. And we can bypass, whereas before the internet, we just had books and it definitely weren't getting the big picture. But now we are able to make these connections and do our own research. And like I said earlier, I highly encourage anybody that's interested in this alternative research to look at things yourself and don't just rely on other people to interpret for you.
Right. Well, I think the collective awareness is definitely getting more and more all the time. It's gaining momentum, especially over the last 3 years or more, and it's cool to see. And in my everyday life, not many people really understand it, but to see the millions of people that are starting to get it is pretty encouraging. And it's all still pretty new to me, and I'm not certain of any of it. But once you start seeing these things, especially the mud flood part, like I try to bring that one up to people all the time just because I'm like, come on, look at this building. It's hard to get people to see it, but sometimes they do, and it's just fun to talk about, anyways.
It seems like when people are ready, they look for it, and it's a harder subject to broach with people that aren't there yet. But that's another great thing about the internet. So thanks for your time, Hans.
All right, I'll be in touch with you, and thanks so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right.
Bye bye.